So let's get back to the talk today. As you might know, the topic today will be an introduction to mobile development and investment options. Today, we are honored to invite Charlie Morris as the speaker to talk to us several things. Himself, let me do a little bit introduction. He is currently a software developer doing iOS development, but he used to be working in a VC in giving investment advices, also to pick different ideas to invest. He studied in is it Harvard or Oxford? Yeah, he studied in Oxford. But actually, I'm quite ashamed about this because actually we work together in my fund. So if you want to know more about what we do, we released some of the apps recently. But I think Charlie can tell more about that as well. So let me hand over the stage to Charlie Morris. And if you have any question, you can keep it, and then we will have a Q&A section after his talk. Yeah, thank you.
Before I get going, can I just get a quick show of hands as to who here is interested in building their own mobile? Cool, quite a few. And who here is kind of more interested in the investment side of things? Fewer, I guess you guys are keeping yourselves to yourselves a bit more. Cool. And everyone, anyone else? Just kind of right place, right time? Okay, so quick introduction to me. So I'm an iOS developer at Mindfund Studio. I work with Harry. At the studio, we spend about kind of 70–80% of our time building our own products that we then release. The other kind of 20–30% of our time we spend as an agency building for other people. Before that, I was working for a VC based out here in Hong Kong called AAIC Ventures. And then before that, I was working in London as a management consultant. So today, there are kind of three things we're going to go through. The first thing is I'm going to do a brief overview of the mobile app market, just so that we're all on the same page as to what is Android, what is iOS, what's their relative market share. The second thing I'm going to do is go into much more detail about your app development options. So what platforms you should be building on, how it is you build mobile apps, and how you should go about it in terms of building yourself, hiring people in-house, or hiring external developers, whether you should go to agencies or freelancers, and kind of how that works. And then finally, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about your investment options, and basically how you get started trying to value apps and investing in apps in Hong Kong. Also, just so you know, at the end of the talk or this evening, I'll send out this slide deck so you don't need to kind of take pictures or write too much, rather you just kind of listen. Cool. Okay, so to start with, I don't know why the top's been cut off, but I think it's okay. So the mobile app market is obviously a massive, massive market, and you read about it a lot. It's big and it's growing. In terms of, so if we look first at smartphone sales, we're up to about, I think, 1.5 billion smartphones were sold last year, which is obviously an enormous amount. In terms of the breakdown between the kind of smartphone platforms, you might be surprised to know that blue is Android. Android is by far and away the most dominant platform in the world. iOS actually makes up a pretty small amount of the smartphone market. A lot of people get that wrong. I guess the wealthier segment of society tends to own iPhones. So if you currently have an iPhone and all your friends have iPhones, that's probably because you're of a certain demographic. You can see, interestingly, so that yellow line that used to be big was Symbian. Anyone know what that used to power? Okay, yeah, exactly. Bonus points. Anyone know what that was written in? How you'd write it? I think you could do C++ was the main form of writing out. But obviously, that's now an obsolete platform. And there are an array of other platforms that do exist, but as you can see, they're absolutely tiny nowadays. So obviously, in terms of numbers of apps downloaded, it's not a surprise that there are more Android apps downloaded off the Google Play Store than off the App Store. However, in terms of revenue, the App Store makes about double the amount that Google Play does, which is pretty amazing if you think about the relative size of the market and the kind of the penetration of Android phones compared to iOS. So yeah, Apple clearly is dominant there, and again, like I said, that's due to the demographic. In terms of how you would monetize an app, four pretty kind of self-explanatory ways. So firstly, is a paid app, so you can sell your app directly on the App Store. Secondly, you can do in-app purchases, so this is becoming kind of increasingly popular. You put your app out for free, and inside there are lots of ways that you can kind of upgrade, or you can buy things in-app. Thirdly, there is a subscription model. This is more if you're kind of a magazine, or that kind of thing, a content player. And finally, there's advertising, which can be both direct. So, in-app, while you're playing Candy Crush at the bottom, you have, your banner ads, or also indirect. So if you're more of a content player, you can have kind of sponsorship, or, your app would be sponsored by a certain person. Only 9% of iOS downloads are actually paid, so it's not very many people pay for apps, but that does make a whopping $35 billion today. So, there is a big market there. Just a quick one on in-app purchases. It's incredible how big this is becoming. The top game players specifically, so Clash of Clans, made $12 million in 1 month last year, just from in-app purchases. It's pretty huge. I think Candy Crush made something like $500 million last year. It's pretty insane. And actually what's really interesting about that is the profile of their users that spend money. About kind of 95% of users, or maybe even more, like 99% of users who spend in the app will spend kind of between like $1 and $5 in their entire lifetime. And then they have what they call whales, where you'll get this like 0.1% of people on Candy Crush that will spend thousands of dollars, which is insane. I find that completely beyond reason, but that happens. And I've heard from a lot of app developers, that's what you find. You get these whales that just spend so much money. So if you are building apps, it's always worth thinking about how can I provide a way for my whale to keep spending money. So if you're going to have some premium thing, don't cap it. Like have loads and loads of different things. You never know. There are clearly these wealthy idiots out there. In terms of how the breakdown on the App Store goes in terms of downloads, obviously games is by far and away the biggest. If you go and look at the top 100 most downloaded apps at any one point in time, about 90% of them will be games. And then after that, there is kind of business, education, all sorts of things. But yeah, games very much at the top. So while there is this very kind of positive spin on, it's a massive market, there's lots of opportunity, I do want to kind of impress on you just how competitive this market is. And I think those statistics on the right-hand side are really telling. So the first being on your onboarding. So onboarding is like, when you download my app, I have a few screens that tell you how it works. You'll lose 50% of your users there. They won't even get into the app. They'll download, they'll start doing it, and then they'll never open you again. So that's pretty terrifying in itself. After 3 days of being installed, 77% of your users will have stopped using your app. And after 90 days, you'll only have 5% of people who originally downloaded your app. These are terrifying statistics, really, really scary. And you've got to realize this is the average. And it is quite disheartening. And I know, as an app developer, I'll release something and I'll get those downloads, and I'll see a few weeks later I have hardly anyone opening my apps. And that's just the market you're in. Users are very fickle. There's so much choice. They're going to turn your app on there. They're probably going to bid it pretty quickly. So when you're thinking about whether or not to invest in apps or building apps, you really keep in mind it's so competitive. You've got to have a great idea. You've got to really believe in it, and you've got to believe in the companies that you're backing. Great. So hopefully that's given you kind of a bit of an overview of the market and where we are today. So I'm going to spend a bit more time talking about development, and there are 3 things in particular I'm going to talk about. So to start with, I'm going to talk about the platforms that you can develop on. Should you be developing on iOS or Android, or on Windows or Sailfish, or there are a whole range of other places you could develop. Secondly, how do you develop for those platforms? How can you develop for iOS and Android? Literally, how does it work? I'm going to show you, some of my programs that I use, some code, just so you have like a real kind of high-level understanding of how it works. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk a bit about should you be building yourselves? Should you be hiring in-house? Should you be getting an agency? And how do you go around doing that? So firstly, what platform? That's kind of funny because it's completely true. iOS users tend to be of a slightly higher demographic, much more willing to spend 99 cents. Your Android users, maybe a little bit harder. And apologies to those of you, who maybe take that personally. I don't mean that personally. That's kind of what we see. So, in terms of platforms, what can you develop on? Obviously, two massive platforms, iOS and Android. There are other ones, Windows, BlackBerry, and there are reasons why you might want to develop on those. I'd suggest probably not great reasons, but they do exist. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Ecosystems. So this is really important. When you're thinking about what you want to develop on, there's a whole range of things you need to think about. So obviously, the highest level is the smartphone itself. If you're developing for iOS, it's can only be used on an iPhone. So you're immediately eliminating people that don't have iPhones. But there are benefits to that. iPhones are well made. If you're going on Android, there are a range of Android devices. You have no real control over the quality of the build. There are some really cheap Android devices out there. And so if you've got someone downloading your app on their Android device, it doesn't work. It might not be necessarily your fault. It might not be the fault of you as the developer. It could be that they just have a really crap phone. And that's not helping things. The marketplace, the App Store is very different from the Google Play Store, and it's specifically when you come to marketing, Apple is maybe a little bit cleaner. You can also get things like Apple features and Google features, and do you know anyone at Apple? Can you leverage your relationships to try and get those kind of features? So that's kind of pretty important. Payment infrastructure, so do you want to be using things like the Apple Wallet or your Google Wallet or that kind of thing. Additional services, so stuff like do you want to sync with iCloud or again sync with Google's cloud, Game Center, marketing tools as I mentioned, developer tools. So if you are the developer yourself, do you want to be building in Swift on iOS, on Xcode? Do you want to be building in Java or Android Studio? And there are a whole host of other tools around that. So when you're a developer, Apple has this kind of suite of products that you get for being a paid-up Apple developer, which costs like $99 a year. So they give you a ton of analytics and things, so that's useful. And then obviously, integrating with other devices. So are you wanting to integrate with Android watches? In which case you can't really do that off an iPhone or it's certainly harder. So all things to think about. And then market considerations as well. I've talked about it a bit too much now already, but demographics, C-level executives are going to use iPhones most likely. Funny one, in Finland there's a really high propensity of Windows mobile users, I guess because of the original kind of Nokia thing. So if you did want to build outside of Android and iOS, if you're specifically building for Finland, not a bad idea. And Africa and Latin America, funnily enough, have a relatively high proportion of BlackBerry, definitely higher than the rest of the world. So so really think about your target market, who are you targeting, and also if you're trying to build a viral product and you need everyone to have it, realistically you need to be developing in both iOS and Android. And that's definitely an important thing to think about. Harry and I worked on a product last year that had a real kind of viral aspect to it, and we built it originally in iOS thinking, well, if it goes well, we'll expand out to Android. And what we found pretty quickly is that our users were basically saying, we really like it, but you don't have Android, so I can't share this, I can't do this with half my friends, so I'm not going to use it. So that was kind of a good lesson for us. What about Hong Kong? I'm sure you've seen something like that somewhere. It's actually because of that exact scenario, it's quite hard to get really good statistics on what the real penetration of devices is, because so many people have devices. There's something like the penetration of smartphones in Hong Kong is about kind of close to 200%. Most people on average have two phones. So clearly Android is the leader, still quite a bit of iOS and a few others. And on tablet it's the other way around. Obviously the iPad is very, very prevalent. Cool, so that's kind of the market. So definitely you need to be thinking about that. So next, how do we actually develop? What does it mean to be developing natively and to be developing in a hybrid environment? So the first thing I want to do is just give you some terminology. I'm going to talk about all of these three things. It's important that you understand what I'm talking about. So firstly, there are things called web apps. And what a web app is essentially is a responsive website. So when you go on it on your phone, you're literally just on a website. You're on the internet, and it might look like a mobile app, and it might feel a bit like a mobile app, but you're literally just on the internet. And that's accessed basically through a browser. You can, I don't know if you've ever tried this, but if you're on a web page, you can like bookmark it on your home screen. I think that's the term, and that will literally create what looks like a little app widget, or like so and then you click on that, and it will just directly take you to that site. So that's kind of the idea of a web app. Some people would say it's not really an app, but it's out there. Next is a native app. So a native app is built using native code. So when Steve Jobs invented the iPhone, he said, if you want to build apps, you need to write the apps in Objective-C. You need to use our program, you need to write in Objective-C, and then we will distribute it through the App Store. And that is native code. Apple has since released another language called Swift. So to write natively for iOS, you can either build in Objective-C or in Swift. And if you want to build for Android, you write in Java. And so, totally different ecosystems. You're building in order to build natively. You have to write two separate code bases. There's no sharing there. But the big benefits are there. You're downloading from the App Store. It's kind of how apps are intended or originally planned to be built, so you have access to everything, and everything's kind of set up for you as a developer to do that. Thirdly, there's a thing called hybrid apps. And hybrid apps were invented because basically developers realized it's pretty ridiculous to have one app with two code bases. And it's very expensive to do that, yada, yada, yada. So people started building what they call hybrid apps. And what it is you use web languages to build one code base. You then have these native wrappers. So you have this Objective-C wrapper and this JavaScript wrapper that goes around it, so that with your one code base, you can ship it to both app stores in what the App Store sees as a native setting. So you're doing one code base written in web languages, which is basically JavaScript, HTML, CSS. You're writing in that, but then it is shipping to both app stores. And I'm going to go into more detail now. So obviously, big benefit. You're writing one code base. The downside at the moment is that it's a bit glitchy. It's not, if you want the best experience, it's not going to be on hybrid. So you need to think carefully about, how, especially when it comes to animations, how slick and smooth you want this to feel. So going into a little bit more detail on each of them. So web apps. So like I said, refers to websites that behave like apps, but really just websites. So the big upsides, you don't need, as a user, you don't need to install the app. So maybe that's a benefit. Maybe your users, maybe you're releasing something that no one's going to go on the App Store to download, but maybe they would go on a website. It's easy to share, so you don't have to go through the App Store, and obviously you can instantly update it because it is just a website. So if you update it, it just as the user's on there, it will be updated. Whereas obviously with apps, you need the user to be updating their app, to be re-downloading to get the updates you're pushing. Big disadvantage, not on the App Store, is it even real? Question mark. Device capabilities, you don't get access to anything like push notifications, GPS, any of the features on the phone, you don't have access to them.
So it's not like actual APK files for Android, it's just like
yes, it is literally a website viewing on the browser. So native apps, I'm going to go into a bit more depth here. So like I said, so this is how Apple and Google intended you to build apps. And the big advantage is you get complete use of all the capabilities of the devices. So you get the accelerometer, GPS, push notifications, everything that you can think of, you have access to that. And as a developer, you get really easy access to that because everything's been built for you to do that. It's also very high performance. It'll be faster because it's literally built with the native code that your device is kind of waiting to receive. Disadvantages, obviously, if you want to build in the other platform, you are starting from scratch. It's not like you can copy paste code. It's a different language. So how do you actually build? I'm going to just show you quickly how you build iOS and how you build Android. So iOS, so you have a thing called an IDE, which is an integrated development environment. And in iOS's case, it's called Xcode. The language is Objective-C or Swift. And nowadays, anyone getting into development, and most developers have switched to Swift, and it's just much more beautiful, much easier, type safe. There's lots of benefits. And in terms of testing, you can do it on your devices. So you can test apps that are not yet on the App Store using a thing called Test Flight. Also, or if you just plug your phone into a computer, you can upload it. And you also have simulators on your machine. So just to show you, this is Xcode. Yeah, I'm not sure where the top's cut off, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. So Xcode is this IDE. So this is where I write my code. And you have also a thing called storyboards in Xcode, which is kind of like drag and drop functionality, which really speeds things up when you're coming to build. So you're not coding from scratch. Various elements. You can see down in this bottom right-hand corner, Apple gives you, a ton of things already, like pre-built things like switches and buttons and all sorts of things that you can use. So if I want to run this, I can literally, so I literally just press like a play button, and what it will then do is it then will build my code. It turns Swift to the code I've written into machine code, and it runs it here on the simulator. So this is actually an app I built a few months ago for the presidential election. You choose your favourite candidates. This is Donald Trump, and then he flies through an array of his worst nightmares. It is on the App Store. You can download it now. It's free. I make no money from it. I built it on a plane in about 10 hours just for a bit of a laugh. Actually, I lied. I did originally have advertising on this screen using Apple's ad network, and the week I released it, Apple closed down that ad network. I was so pissed off. So there is literally no way for me to make money with this. Anyway. Sorry, I could. Yeah, I'm not sure Don and his mates would be too pleased. Also, most of those candidates are now dropped out, so kind of useless. Anyway, it was fun. So that's a bit of iOS. Next, so Android, very similar situation. You have another IDE which is called Android Studio. The language is Java, and again you can simulate it on a device. So here is Android Studio. You'll see it actually it's pretty similar. You have your coding pages, you have your device here. I'm an iOS developer, so I don't really use this. I have tried using it a bit. I would say if you're looking to get into development, do iOS. It's easier, it's prettier, it's just nicer. It's a nicer experience. But who am I to say? It's pretty similar. It's pretty similar. So that's Android. In terms of going back again, the technical benefits. You have access to all of these things: camera, GPS, accelerometer. These are all things that if you try and develop in hybrid, gets a little bit trickier. I'll talk a bit about that now. So firstly, the big problem with native, as I talked about, 2 code bases, that is expensive, for sure. Especially if you're a small company and you're looking to build 2 code bases to uphold is not cheap. So hybrid development, so this came along a few years ago where people said, okay, this is ridiculous, we're building 2 different code bases, let's try and merge them together, and they thought, how should we do, what language should we do? Let's use the web. Web languages, it's the most prevalent, so this is JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. What is it? It's kind of the best or worst of both worlds. So if you're a web developer, it's great news for you. It's really simple. It's kind of like building a website. You can even test it in the browser. You can use Google like Chrome developer tools to help you build it. But basically what it is, so when I talked about web apps, it is essentially a web app. The difference being that once you built it, you then wrap it in this external program. So the big one is a thing called PhoneGap. That was kind of the original. Nowadays there's a thing called Ionic, which is really powerful and improving all the time. It hit version 1, I think, at the end of last year. And so it's getting quite polished now. And there have been, it's worth looking at. There have been some pretty good apps built in it. But as I said before, if you have something that's heavy on animation or heavy on using device features, you might want to think carefully before you go into hybrid development. How do you build hybrid apps? So it's basically very similar to building web apps. So you use a text editor of choice in the terminal. The language really is JavaScript, and you can test it in Chrome. You can also test it on your device. Just to show you, so this is the text editor that I use. Just called Atom. This is my terminal. So for example, I can So two ways to do it. So I can spin up a little server here, so that in the browser I can literally go to. So this is a thing I built last year when I was kind of helping Swire a little bit. So this is, so if you think about it, like, this is literally an app, just in my browser, and I can debug it on the right-hand side and use Chrome developer tools to do it. Alternatively, with Ionic, you now have this thing where you can actually run it on the simulator. So if I go and run, this will, basically what this does is this is doing the wrapping of that code. Here is an iPhone. So literally that app, that, this web app is now being built and run on my simulator, on my iPhone simulator. So it's pretty decent. It's pretty decent, and actually a really big benefit going back to this version is debugging apps can be a bit tricky for numerous reasons. But debugging a website is much easier because you have kind of this kind of live ability to debug. So that's definitely a benefit in the hybrid mode. So moving on. Yeah. So like I said, Ionic. That's kind of, as far as I know, that's kind of the most prevalent hybrid tool out at the moment. Actually, Ionic has quite a cool, just get this up, builder. So even if you're not a developer, it has this tool where you can actually just do drag and drop. So you can get quite a long way using Ionic by just dragging and dropping stuff, which is it's pretty funky, and I can only see that kind of improving in the next few years. So I think there's kind of a lot of legs. It's got a lot of legs. Okay, brief word about the back end. When you build an app, so for example, my Air Force One app is purely front end. I'm not that app. When you're using that app, you're not communicating with other users. You're not sharing pictures with anyone. It's all on the front end. So when I ship that code, you download the code, and that's all you're already doing. You're kind of very contained within my app. If you're on Facebook or on a social network or on some kind of sharing platform, you're going to have a back end, which is where all the information is stored. So you're taking pictures, they're being uploaded. And so, any kind of, this will require things called APIs. So if you're thinking of building an app and you need sharing functionality and that kind of ability to communicate between users, you're going to need to think about a back end and how that's built. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but definitely a consideration you need to be thinking about. It will obviously become more expensive as well. So, should you build it yourself or should you get it? Firstly, I'm going to talk about Wireframe. Regardless of whether or not you want to hire someone else or do it yourself, I strongly recommend that you wireframe out your product. And there are varying degrees of fidelity to do that. And by fidelity, I mean kind of completeness. So on the low side, you can literally just have a pen and paper, and you can sketch out, how your app should work. And you have to do that. If you want to get an app built, either for yourself or if you want to give it to an agency, you have to do that. As a developer, if you've got to develop and say, I've got this great idea, and you just talk to them about it, they're not going to have any real idea how it should work, what it should look like. Do you want a toolbar at the top? How should the navigation work? When I press on this, what happens? As a developer, you don't want the scope for a developer to try and imagine what you're thinking. You want them to you want to build out beforehand as close a depiction of your app as possible. So when you give it to the developer, they just go, okay, cool, I completely see what it is you're building. So on the far right hand side, if you're going to build it in Photoshop, or we tend to use a thing called Sketch, you can build that super high quality exactly how it should look and feel. So when you give it to a developer, they know exactly how it should look and feel. And I think it's so useful for you to do that, because you'll get your head around it so much more. You'll think you have a great idea of your app. You'll start doing this and you'll realise there's so many situations you haven't thought about. What happens when I go back? Maybe your app is connected to the internet. What happens when your user doesn't have an internet connection? Or they try and do something and it's not connected to the internet and it fails. What happens then? What screen pops up? So many things that you should think about. So 100% you have to wireframe. Moving on from there, if you are not a developer, but you would like to build an app, there are an increasing number of, so what you see is what you get. That's that big acronym. So there are tons of places online where you can just do drag and drop. and they tend to charge you like not very much. You do it all online for free, and then if you actually want to push it to the App Store, they'll charge you like maybe a monthly fee. And some of these are pretty cheap. And if you've got something that is pretty simple with pretty simple functionality, definitely a great way to prototype it. It might not be your finished product, but I'd have a look at this stuff. If you actually want to dive into programming, obviously I'm a developer, I strongly support it, I think programming is great. It's not for everyone, and I would say if you're thinking about getting into programming, like think very seriously. You've got to really love this stuff and really love the technology. There are a ton of ways that you can kind of dip your toe into it. So online, there's loads of stuff like Code Academy, Treehouse, Code School, all these places. Specifically iOS, like we use a thing called Ray Wonderlich, it's really, really great. So you can go online, you can test it, you can try it out. If you want to get a bit more serious, there is obviously the real life classes, General Assembly, they run a load of part-time courses. They do evening classes, so just like one-off events to try stuff out. They do part-time courses, they do full-time courses, and there are other organisations that do similar stuff. I would say benefits of doing real-life tutorials is one, you have an instructor at hand. So when if you're on your own and there's a bug, something doesn't work, it can be really, really frustrating. So it is nice to have a developer, or a seasoned programmer there to help you out. Secondly, is you tend to have a class, so that's quite nice, bit of a community. And thirdly, I think if you're paying obviously more money to do that, you kind of force yourself to actually go along to the classes and do it. I think it's much harder to motivate yourself online, but who am I to talk? Maybe you guys can. Okay, next, but buying development skill in-house. There are basically two ways to go about that. One is you go for agencies. Again, in Hong Kong there are a ton of agencies. The big benefit of that is you should expect it to be more reliable. They're professionally doing this. They're going to give you a time frame. You're going to have a timeline. You're going to have a contract. It's going to be pretty well planned out. They've done this many times before. They're going to know how long it's going to take. They're going to know the pitfalls, and hopefully up front, they're going to give you a price, and hopefully it's realistic, and you can make decisions. Yes, it's definitely going to be more expensive than if you get freelancers, but I guess what you're paying for is the quality and the reliability. Freelancers can work really well, and if you don't have so much money and maybe your app's not so complicated and you're just looking to get a prototype out, definitely nothing wrong with going through the freelancing route. Locally, even in Cocoon, I'm sure there are freelancers sitting here in all the co-working spaces. I think definitely try, if you're going to do freelancing with freelancers, it's good to meet with them face to face if you can. I think that's definitely beneficial. There are, and I think there are freelancing websites that are getting better. I think Crew is a really good freelancing website, Upwork as well, and I think they're getting better themselves at trying to improve the reliability. The big problem that you have with freelancers is, freelancer sitting here might be an absolute rock star, and because he's an absolute rock star, Facebook offers him a job next week for an obscene amount of money, and he leaves, and he says to you, "Oh, I'm really sorry, didn't finish it, sorry." And that does happen quite a bit. And the other problem with freelancers is you guys probably have no idea how good your freelancer is. Because some guy says, "Oh, I'm a developer, I can build stuff and look at code," and you go, "Oh, cool," you really have no idea whether this is a relative newbie or whether he's really quite special. Whereas with an agency, again, you just have that kind of level of security. You can see the apps they've built before. Go into go into the studio, look at their team, check that they're all a bunch of guys sitting around computers with a load of code. That's a good sign. So yeah, those are your options. Cool. Well, so that's kind of my chunk on development. I'm going to spend a bit